Okay, good. In our brief time together, I'm going to talk, this is basically a 5-minute advertisement for one particular GitHub repo, which I encourage you to check out. So this is a GitHub repo we've been working on for 3 years in the context of a class I've been teaching at Columbia for 3 years with a history professor named Matt Jones. Okay. That is an old version of this deck, so I'm really not even sure what's going to happen. It's going to be like karaoke here to see what comes up. So, yeah, so on the left is a dumpster fire because we all recognize that there's problems. Professor Cogburn introduced you to a couple of the dumpster fires. We've constructed this class around advancing dumpster fireology. Dumpster fireology being a field that's really blossomed in the last 3 years of enumerating dumpster fires. So we wanted to go from dumpster fires to hope and to believing that we're going to move to infinity and beyond with a bunch of Columbia undergraduates and teach them that it's not just dumpster fires. You can't hear me? Okay, good. I'm going to try to be louder. Thank you. Okay, good. I'm going to try to be louder. So the class is about not just rehashing dumpster fireology, which is really advanced in the last 3 years, but moving on to talking about solutions. And we do that in Python, which is why Jupyter is in the middle here. That is, we try to create a class that combines critical engagement with data with functional engagement with data. Also, as advertised, I split my time between Columbia and the New York Times, which is why I'm giving a talk about a class. Good. So it's a 14-week class, so it's useful to teach the class in terms of a set of intellectual transitions. As mentioned, I co-teach this class with Matt Historian, who's a real historian, sorry, Matt Jones, who's a real historian, whereas I am merely a fan of history. So we teach the class in the form of several intellectual transitions. The birth of statistics as a word in English, which is kind of fun because you get to parse the philology of what people meant by statistics, and also immediately you see how statistics is contested. It was brought in as a word about statecraft, and then a bunch of nerds started making tables of numbers, and right away you see the fight about what is truth. And the role of data in fighting for truth is centuries old, so that's a nice thing to introduce students to. Vulgar statistics is what people derided at when you started using numbers to understand statecraft. Mathematical statistics and the birth of quantitative racism. It's right there in the first usage of the word regression, which we introduce people to. As soon as computation happens, one of the very first usages of digital computation is to make sense of data, specifically in code breaking. This is a history which was occult until like the 90s when a lot of it became declassified. So that's a fun history to engage with. Also, immediately you see the role of labor and gender. That right away, like the men were doing the math and the women were just plugging things in. It's a lot of great literature and also fun to connect to front-end debates. I like to debates on Medium about front-end and back-end engineering and who's doing the real work. Then the role of data science in the signals intelligence community, and eventually we talk about sort of our modern incorporation of AI and machine learning into our worlds. Okay, each one of the, oh, cool. Sorry, genuinely cool. So each one of these transitions is not just an intellectual advance. We also try to talk about how each one of these intellectual advances comes with, oh man, a rearrangement of power. See, technology. The answer is always more technology. So each one of these transitions is also a transition of power. So we try to not shy away from the political aspect of intellectual advances. Each one of these intellectual advances was sponsored by somebody and supported by somebody and rearranged power. My feeling there was I was impacted by an essay which somebody showed me in fall of 2016, probably December of 2016. A data scientist I know, Ben Recht at Berkeley, introduced me to this essay by cryptographer Rogaway about the moral character of cryptographic work. First sentence, cryptography rearranges power. It configures who can do what from what. This makes cryptography an inherently political tool. So my friend Ben sent me this paper and said, substitute cryptography for data science and think about all the things that we are doing in data science and how we are rearranging power with each one of those intellectual advances. So that's the talk. No. So as an example, I think I'll just do it using my digits rather than digitally. So as an example, 1 week we take The Mismeasure of Man, which is a great book, which opens with a deeply racist quote. Thanks for encouraging us not to shy away from racism. And talk about the birth of quantitative racism in the form of early mathematical statistics by Galton. Galton, the person who gave us the word correlation, the word regression, and the word eugenics. And then we deeply engage directly with Galton's data. So we fire up Python and people actually do the first regression, not their first regression, but the first regression. and then people get to play with it. Then we talk about the birth of digital computation in World War II and the role of gender. Breaking Codes and Finding Women at the Dawn of Digital Age is a great essay about this, comparing what was happening on both sides of the Atlantic and the gendering of labor as soon as data became about computation. And then finally, we talk about ethics. So I say finally, but the truth is, it's a recurring theme from the class. You don't talk about power and rearrangement of power without thinking through ethics. We don't need to tell students anymore that ethics is important for data at this point. Again, dumpster fireology being well developed in 2019. They come to the class asking us to talk about the ethical impact of data. We have to be careful when we talk about ethics. Part of the discourse right now around ethics is maligning the existence of the word ethics because people are so tired of it being used without clear definition. Again, being somebody who comes from academia, that makes me sad because many people worked really, really hard to define ethics. So we try to introduce them to the history of people defining ethics and operationalizing it. We would like for ethics to be a branch of philosophy, we technologists, because that reminds us of logic. I'm a mathematician, so logic makes me think about math, and math makes me think about proof, and proof is my happy place. Or when you think about logic, maybe that's nice for you because you were raised a computer scientist, and then that's nice because it's got abstractions and separations of concerns, and APIs is like your happy place. But that is not the whole role of ethics. When we talk about ethics, it's not like we're asking for a more philosophically developed system, right? We're actually asking for a sociological function. We're asking for something that's kind of like law in government, except it's a set of norms, standards, practices, rules that make us all feel the legitimacy of these different communities, whether that community is a corporation or a group of people without that sort of power structure. So we talked quite a bit in class about the function of defining ethics and about the function of designing for ethics, whether that design is a process design or an institutional design, and ultimately a design of power. We try to make clear to people, and we introduce them to a literature about ethics theater, including from Meredith Whitaker, who's here in New York City, about the danger about having something that's just sociological without any clear definition of things and without any power behind it. That is a sad place, the ethics theater place. So, as we emphasize to the student, a bunch of people worked real hard to define ethics, and all of these definitions are useless unless you also design for ethics. And here by design, I mean Mike Montero's definition that design is an intentional solution to a problem within a set of constraints. For example, so we spent, again, being teaching with a historian and coming from the academia, I'm very interested in teaching students one example of how people defined ethics in the 70s in the form of Belmont Principles. Belmont Principles involve respect for personhood, of which informed consent is sort of a derived special case. Beneficence, of which do no harm, is sort of a special case, but that's kind of lame because if I never interact with you, I will do no harm. And justice, which was one of the original Belmont Principles from the 70s, which includes fairness. So this is an example of a set of principles which people worked hard to define and worked hard to operationalize. And we try to introduce them to that as an example of a durable framework which gives you an ethical audit of decisions from which your rules, code, and your design should derive. Finally, we talk about what is to be done. And so we talk about the fact that corporate power doesn't exist in a vacuum. Corporate power is part of an unstable balance among corporate power, state power, and people power. And all of us, particularly those of us who work for corporations, have a lot of people power, which we do not always realize or exercise. The last year in the form of walkouts has been one example of people saying, I'm not going to do that anymore. And overcoming the most pernicious and dangerous form of cognitive bias, which is W-2 bias. When somebody pays you and you're like, okay, whatever you say must be good. So we try to encourage people to understand that, like, if you are a group of 10 people in some tech platform company and you're 10 data scientists, you may be like also 10% of the data science workforce. When you walk, that has an order 1 effect on that company. That's it. So our lessons learned were history and ethics can be taught, integrated throughout a tech class. There's always ways to draw parallels to today easily, even if you're talking about the 18th century. Capabilities always rearrange power. And the story of data is throughout a story of truth and power contested. Finally, when we get to the end of the class, we want them not just to know that there are dumpster fires, but they have an impact on those dumpster fires in their future by understanding the unstable balance between people power, state power, and corporate power. I think that's it. And with that, I encourage you to check out this repo, which has the entire syllabus and all the code available online. Thank you.